Nuts. Big nuts. Tiny nuts. Humongous nuts. Massive nuts. Tiny nuts. Fat nuts. Big nuts. Nuts. Wheel nuts. We are all nuts. These nuts. Fat nuts. Big juicy nuts. Massive nuts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 nuts. These nuts. Peanuts. Hazelnuts. Peanuts, 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 peanuts. Juicy nuts. Big nuts. These nuts, these nuts, these nuts, these nuts, these nuts, these nuts. These nuts, these nuts, these nuts, these nuts, these nuts, these nuts. Fat, juicy nuts. Nuts, nuts. Nutty, 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 nuts. Nuts, 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 nuts. You don't have nuts. Big nuts. Tiny nuts. Massive nuts. Humongous nuts. Tiny nuts. Fat nuts. Juicy nuts. Big nuts. Massive nuts. Jeep nuts. Jeep, 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 Jeep. I'm kidding. Massive nuts. Fat nuts. Tiny nuts. Fat nuts. You're a nut. We're all nuts. Nuts. Big nuts. Fat nuts. Juicy nuts. Massive nuts. Tiny nuts. Fat nuts. Humongous nuts. Tiny nuts. Massive nuts. Nuts, 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 nuts. Big nuts, tiny nuts, humongous nuts, massive nuts, tiny nuts, little nuts. Suck my nuts. Lick my nuts. Big nuts, big nuts, big nuts, big nuts, big nuts, big nuts, big nuts. Tiny nuts, tiny nuts, tiny nuts. We could do 12 minutes of nuts. Nuts, nuts. Nuts, 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 nuts. These nuts, these nuts, these nuts. Nuts, 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 nuts. Tiny nuts, massive nuts. Fat nuts, juicy nuts. Are these nuts over here? Are these nuts? These nuts? Big nuts. Massive nuts. Giant nuts. Pro nuts. Juicy nuts. Itchy armpit nuts. That's pretty lit nuts. Nuts, 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 nuts. Thanks for watching. This nutty nutty nut 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 video. Nut 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 nut